So we are recording. All right, so this is our last meeting regarding the nervous system. It's almost our last meeting, which is good news. I know it makes you sad, makes me sad too. But just so you know, I know that you realize we have not been able to cover every single section regarding all of the chapters on the nervous system. The reason is because it's so complex. There's so much information that we couldn't possibly do it all. We could spend an entire semester easily just studying this one system. So let's just get through the last bits of what you're going to be required to know for this course. And we are in chapter 14 of your book. I jotted down a few notes before I sat down this morning, and we are going to start with the visceral reflex arc. Now, it should be plural, actually, visceral reflex arcs, because there's obviously more than one. So reflex arcs are just, I mentioned this way back when, and it was defined well in chapter 13. It was not a section that we really covered. Somatic reflex arcs were covered back in chapter 13, but I am going to look a little bit more in depth with visceral reflex arcs. This just means this is what's going on basically in our viscera, which is our abdominal cavity, our thoracic and abdominal cavity, our insides, think of it that way, our visceral organs. And a reflex arc is just something, it's a neural arc that goes from sensory receptor, sensory afferent pathway, integration, and then motor output. But it's something that we don't have to really think about, consciously think about. Our body just does it. I gave you a somatic reflex example a long time ago about the typical banging right below your patella, your kneecap, and your lower leg shoots up. That's an example of a reflex arc in which the integration only has to go as far as the spinal cord. There are both innate or sort of embedded reflex arcs that we don't have to learn, and then there are learned and required reflexes as well. So something like pupil dilation and constriction from light in the room or available light in the environment, that is obviously an innate reflex arc that just happens. And it's actually considered a visceral one. But even something like driving a car, that would be a learned or an acquired reflex. You have reflexes when you drive. You don't even have to think about it, you just do. And those would be learned or acquired reflexes. Anyway, there are 5 components to visceral reflex arcs, just like somatic ones. Remember, somatic skeletal muscle, voluntary skeletal muscle. We're specifically going to cover visceral ones though today. There are 5 components that just go, and you know this pathway. It's typical neural pathway. It just goes receptor, sensory neuron, integration, motor neuron to an effector organ. Those are the 5 components that are the same in both somatic reflex arcs and visceral. But the motor efferent pathway has 2 motor neurons in a visceral reflex arc. So this is sort of special. Visceral reflex arcs have 2. There's a 2 motor neuron chain or relay in visceral reflex arcs. That's different than somatic. I'm just going to write not so in somatic reflex arcs. They only have 1 motor neuron. So there's a difference right away. And the other obvious difference is the afferent fibers are basically visceral sensory neurons. So there's just some differences or uniqueness about this. That one's pretty obvious. Two classic examples of a visceral reflex arc would be something like elimination of feces, and that's a reflex, a visceral reflex of the rectum, or elimination of the bladder in the urinary system are two very obvious and well-used examples of visceral reflex arc. There are, this is sort of unique also, there are visceral reflex arcs that's supposed to be THAT, that can exist exclusively in the GI tract or in the viscera itself. So in the walls of this is sort of unique as well. The GI tract, that stands for gastrointestinal tract. Just think of digestion. I know you haven't had A&P2 yet, but the gastrointestinal tract, so let's just go down, say, like to the intestines. The small intestines are just a tube. There are reflex arcs, visceral reflex arcs within, I'm going to draw the stomach attached to the intestine. There are visceral reflex arcs that don't even have to go back to the central nervous system, that can be stimulated within the wall of the, say, for example, the intestine, and then feed back directly to the stomach and cause something to happen. So there are reflex arcs entirely contained within the GI tract itself. That's also sort of unique. And we call this the enteric. We usually use the term enteric for intestinal context. So the word enteric, just think intestine. Enteric nervous system is an example of this visceral reflex arcs entirely within the GI tract itself. Now I'm going to talk about acetylcholine. I need to turn on a light. It's getting so dark outside so that I can see my notes. Now I'm going to talk about acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Just a little bit more. We know these are both neurotransmitters in the autonomic nervous system. I'm just going to write ANS. This one also participates in somatic, as a somatic neurotransmitter. But we're mostly concerned about in its context with the autonomic nervous system. So let's do some definitions. We're just building a glossary here so that we can use these words and you know what they mean. Fibers that release acetylcholine specifically are called cholinergic fibers. Oops, that was supposed to be a. Okay, so this word is directly attached to that neurotransmitter. You know this, I'm just going to remind you, all preganglionic fibers of the autonomic system are called cholinergic fibers. And preganglionic fibers of the ANS and postganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system. So I'm just going to write and postganglionic of specifically the parasympathetic division are also cholinergic. Anything that releases acetylcholine. All postganglionic, that was supposed to be 2 L's, all postganglionic fibers of sympathetic nervous system are called adrenergic. And adrenergic fibers release norepinephrine as their neurotransmitter. So that last diagram that I drew yesterday, that busy diagram, comparing somatic nerve fibers, parasympathetic nerve pathways, and sympathetic neural pathways. Now we can attach just new terms. Anything that releases acetylcholine is cholinergic. Any fibers that release norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter are adrenergic receptors. Those are just definitions. Now there's an exception to this. To this rule. Postganglionic sympathetic fibers, the vast majority of them are adrenergic, but except for these. The ones that innervate are eccrine sweat glands in the skin. These actually secrete acetylcholine. So the exception to that, I'm going to go back to this previous page. You just said all postganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system are adrenergic and release norepinephrine. Well, there's an exception to that rule, and that is these postganglionic sympathetic fibers that innervate our sweat glands secrete acetylcholine, so they would be called technically cholinergic fibers. Okay. Now, acetylcholine and norepinephrine can be excitatory or inhibitory. You know that. I'm just reminding you. You know why. You may have forgotten, but you know why. It's based on receptor types at the effector organ. So let's just examine cholinergic receptors. There's two major subclasses. So we're talking about receptors at the effector organ that can bind acetylcholine, all right? And there's two subclasses. I'm just going to remind you, ACH. The first type is called nicotine receptors. And the reason these get their name is because it was discovered that the chemical nicotine can bind to these receptors. That's where it actually gets its name. Because in a lab, it was discovered that nicotine binds to these particular receptors. Okay. And the second type I'll list after we talk about nicotine receptors in detail. So these types of cholinergic receptors are found here. These are the location. All postganglionic neurons. Which means in the cell body, the soma and dendrite region of those neurons of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Because remember, we're talking about the receptors that receive this. And if all preganglionic neurons secrete this, then all postganglionic neurons have to have receptors to receive it. That's all that statement is saying. Now, here are specific locations within the human body. In addition to all of these postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, I'm going to write additional locations. The hormone producing cells, of the adrenal medulla. The adrenal glands are located above each kidney, almost sitting on top of our kidneys. I'm going to go to a new page so I can draw a quick picture. So the adrenal glands, they're these masses of tissue that have a cortex, and then they have a middle part called the medulla. That's where the hormone producing cells are, in the adrenal medulla. And they specifically ad means next to, renal means kidney. So these cells within the renal medulla, they secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. And they're susceptible, they have receptors for nicotine-based receptors, cholinergic receptors. So the adrenal medulla, I'm just going to say, have so they're a type of cholinergic receptors that when acetylcholine is released on them from a nerve cell, the hormone producing cells then secrete these two hormones. And you're thinking, norepinephrine, that's a neurotransmitter, it's not a hormone. Well, it can behave as both, which adds to the confusion. This can be a neurotransmitter. It can also be, it's also considered a hormone. We have hormone-like actions. So we've also got additional location nicotine receptors. We've got three basic locations. I'm going to go back and just remind you. First, nicotine receptors are found on all postganglionic neurons, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. They're also found, nicotine receptors are also found on the adrenal medulla cells that secrete epi and norepinephrine. And finally, all skeletal muscle motor end plates on skeletal muscle cells, that's where the receptors are for acetylcholine. have nicotine receptors as well. Just remember, this is the somatic nervous system. The first two are the autonomic nervous system divisions. Last thing I'm going to say about nicotine receptors, the act of acetylcholine binding to a nicotinic receptor is always stimulatory. That means it always causes depolarization of the membrane of the effector of the receiving cell. Okay, so that covers, I'm trying to help keep you organized. Oops, wrong board. I'm just going back to the previous board. So that covers number one, nicotine receptors, which is a subclass of cholinergic receptors. So the reason I'm going on to a new board to write in number two is here's the second type of cholinergic receptor, and it's called that's an muscarinic, muscarinic. Just like nicotine receptors get their name because nicotine binds to them, that chemical nicotine, muscarinic receptors get their name because muscarine, which is a poison that comes from a type of mushroom, can also bind to, that poison binds to these types of receptors that we find in the human body. This type of cholinergic receptor is found on all effector cells. Stimulated by cholinergic fibers. So I'm going to put in parentheses. All parasympathetic target organs. Plus, in addition, sweat glands of the sympathetic nervous system. I'll just remind you that those are sympathetic. So we find muscarinic receptors on all effector cells stimulated by cholinergic fibers. Here's what happens. Here's the process. When acetylcholine binds to muscarinic receptors, the effect can be stimulatory or inhibitory. So either one. So unlike nicotine receptors, where it's always stimulatory, muscarinic receptors can be stimulatory or inhibitory, and I'm not going to write this out for the time. You know why. It's dependent on the receptor of the effector organ, the receiving cell receptors. So just to remind you where we are, trying to keep you organized, we just finished two different types of cholinergic receptors. Subclass nicotine receptors and subclass muscarinic receptors. Now I'm going to talk about adrenergic receptors briefly. And some of this gets too complicated for this level of anatomy and physiology course. But I do want to talk about this. These adrenergic receptors are norepinephrine binding, just to remind you, not acetylcholine. And there's two different types. There's alpha adrenergic receptors, which is designated by the symbol, a Greek alpha sign, and beta adrenergic receptors, which is signified by the Greek letter beta. It looks like a small lowercase b with this tail at the beginning of it. So on these receptor types, norepinephrine or epinephrine can bind to these receptors. They can be stimulatory or inhibitory based on the type of receptor at the effector cell. There's all sorts of subclasses of alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, and they have opposite effects at different times. They can, a single effector organ can contain both subclasses of alpha, beta. It gets mind-boggling, this network, this spider web of adrenergic receptors. So I just want you to know that this term, adrenergic, means norepinephrine binding in the autonomic nervous system, but they have the ability to bind with either norepinephrine or epinephrine, and the effects can be stimulatory or inhibitory based on the particular effector organ and the conditions that it's under. Last topic here, guys. It's going to be a nice short lecture today. Let's just look at the effects, some of the effects of parasympathetic. Those blings in my phone lighting off weather reports because it's pouring down rain where I am right now, and thunderstorms. Effects of parasympathetic and sympathetic. So I already listed specific effects of each of these divisions of the autonomic nervous system, but your book, it's sort of to conclude. Let me get rid of my phone. Sorry, that was just annoying me. I had to get rid of that. What your book concludes on this autonomic nervous system business is first they go on to iterate, and I said this I think yesterday or the day before, that even though these systems, they innervate basically the same organs, not completely, but the vast majority of organs are innervated in our body, both by parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons. And they basically have opposite effects on those organs. But neither one is completely turned on while the other one is completely turned off. So the whole point of this conversation is there's always a combination of effects going on in our body, even at the organismal level, in which parasympathetic effects are working and sympathetic effects are working at the same time, but usually one is sort of overriding the other one to some degree. And this one, just remember, I'm not going to go through all of the effects on specific organs that I listed before. Rest and digest. This one's fight or flight. We're just going to say some things about their antagonism and synchronization. So you know that these basically, the two of these have antagonistic actions. That's just another way of saying opposite effects. And they're especially we see these opposite effects. So I'm just going to write especially on these organs: heart, cardiac system, respiratory systems, and GI organs, gastrointestinal. Just think digestive system. So particularly on the heart, bronchi and lungs, and our gastrointestinal tract, these two systems have completely opposite effects. So even though these are just some sort of outlier highlights to note, even though the parasympathetic, we know it as the rest and digest. In other words, when we are, it's major homeostatic subdivision that's in play when we are just sitting there like you are right now listening to this. Even though the parasympathetic is rest and digest, it's the sympathetic nervous system that largely regulates blood pressure. So that this is sort of an anomaly or an outlier that we wouldn't think. Everybody says rest, digest, rest, digest. You know, keeping blood pressure under control is one of those functions, but that is controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. It regulates blood pressure. How? By constricting and dilating our blood vessels. How that works is our blood vessels have a layer in their wall of smooth muscle that's innervated by sympathetic fiber. When they are stimulated by sympathetic fibers, our vessels constrict. Those muscles in the wall of the vessels contract, causing constriction. When the sympathetic fiber, so we get firing, let me just, the picture speaks 1,000 words. So if this is an artery, here's an artery in our body, and here are sympathetic fibers innervating that smooth muscle in the wall of the artery. If we get sort of a rapid fire, neural fire of this sympathetic fiber, it causes that vessel to constrict. Those muscles contract and the vessel constricts. If we fire this nerve, the sympathetic nerve fiber, less frequently, the muscles relax and it causes that vessel to dilate like this. So that sympathetic control and firing on our vessels really regulates our overall blood pressure. It's constantly innervating our vessels, and it's a term we call vasomotor tone. This refers to the overall constricted state of blood vessels it's called vasomotor tone. Overall constricted state of blood vessels due to sympathetic nervous system stimulation. It's not a difficult concept. Even when you're asleep, when you're at your most relaxed state physically, the sympathetic nervous system is still holding our vessels in somewhat of a constricted state. That's to help keep blood pressure, maintain blood pressure at a healthy level so that we get enough circulation to our organs. All right, now let's look at parasympathetic, some highlights of the parasympathetic before we call this a day. Parasympathetic nervous system is the major controller of digestion, the heart, and urinary system. Why? So we just said that the sympathetic nervous system is the major controller of blood pressure due to something called vasomotor tone. The parasympathetic nervous system almost exclusively controls the act of digestion, our heart rate, and urinary system, forming and release of formed urine. How? In the parasympathetic innervation of the digestive system, it innervates smooth muscle contractions. In the heart, it innervates cardiac muscle. And it actually slows contractions here. So it's not excitatory, it's inhibitory. And the urinary system, it innervates smooth muscle. So in these three systems, smooth muscle is the effector organ of the digestive system, cardiac muscle is the effector organ in the heart, and smooth muscle is the effector tissue in the urinary system. Here's sort of an anomaly as well. Parasympathetic also controls most glands in the body, except our eccrine sweat glands and the adrenal glands. Those are under sympathetic control. So just to reiterate, this is the last thing I promise I'm going to say today, special functions of sympathetic nervous system. So these are organs only receiving sympathetic stimulation. So I'm going to write no parasympathetic innervation. Our blood vessels, and we already went over that with regulating blood pressure. Our kidneys also only receive sympathetic innervation. We know this one. Sweat glands, the erector pili muscles in the skin associated with those hair follicles. and the adrenal medulla. The sympathetic nervous system also largely regulates day-to-day body temperature. I'm not talking about necessarily hypothalamic regulating things like fever. I'm talking about regulating body temperature in the context of being in a particular environment. So regulating body temperature, how does the sympathetic nervous system do that? Well, by regulating blood flow, vessels, and sweat glands. For example, if we are really hot, say you've been exercising, physically exercising, blood vessels that are close to the skin dilate so that circulation, blood flow increases in those vessels. That's why oftentimes the hue of your skin can become pink or red. That's to release heat. It's a cooling mechanism. Likewise, if you've been exercising, your sweat glands are innervated by sympathetic fibers to secrete eccrine sweat, that watery sweat. That's also a cooling mechanism. Conversely, if we walk into a cold environment, walk outside in February without a jacket on, vessels that are close to your skin, to the surface of your body, constrict, and blood flow in those areas is reduced. That's to conserve body heat. So those are examples of how the sympathetic nervous system can regulate body temperature. Finally, this is how sympathetic nervous system can also regulate BP. So we already know this one, that sympathetic nervous system constricts vessels. That's a direct feedback mechanism. But there's another more indirect mechanism that the sympathetic nervous system can regulate or increase blood pressure, and it's by stimulating kidneys. I'm not going to go into this great detail because you'll get it in A&P2 when you study the kidneys and the urinary system. But the sympathetic fibers can stimulate the kidneys to secrete renin. Probably heard of that. It's an enzyme that causes the conversion / secretion of a hormone called angiotensin II. This is a hormone that increases blood pressure. So this is an indirect mechanism. And this would be a direct mechanism. Two ways that the sympathetic nervous system increases blood pressure. And finally, sympathetic nervous system can also highly regulate cellular metabolism. It can directly increase the metabolic rate of cells in conjunction with thyroid hormone, by the way. It can also increase levels of blood glucose and release, let's just do this, stored fat or lipid for energy usage. How the sympathetic nervous system increases levels of blood glucose is by stimulating the liver to break down stored glycogen. And it releases glucose into the blood. So that's it. I'm done for the day, guys. Nice short lecture. Just remember that even though the sympathetic and parasympathetic have largely opposite effects in the human body, they're always both at play, usually one more than the other, depending on the conditions of the body and the needs of the body. So if you're just sitting there eating breakfast or watching TV, your parasympathetic nervous system is largely turned on, sympathetic not so much. But then if you decide to go out for a long run or go for a rigorous exercise, then your sympathetic overrides parasympathetic activity, doesn't shut it off completely, but it overrides the parasympathetic activity in order to meet the needs of the demands of the organ systems in our body, to sort of maintain that homeostasis. All right, so let's shut this down. I am done for the day. I will be back here tomorrow morning. You have lecture quiz number 7. Let me shut off my recording here.